New reports show the Pentagon is preparing for an all-out war with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. This includes launching major military drills and deploying thousands of additional forces to Guam, Japan, and South Korea, including additional B-52s, the aircraft that drops nuclear weapons. Top U.S. officials have confirmed Trump's belligerent threats, telling the public to be prepared for war.
And if North Korea does not choose the pathway of engagement, discussion, negotiation, then they themselves will trigger an option.
Tonight, a dire warning from Defense Secretary James Mattis that North Korea should cease any consideration of actions that would lead to the end of its regime and the destruction of its people.
What's different about this approach is that we're out of time, right? As Ambassador Haley said before, we've been kicking the can down the road and we're out of road. There is a military option.
While the Trump regime wants to turn up the heat, the threats have actually triggered highly unusual peace talks between North and South, behind the back of the U.S. empire. But could such talks prevent a determined U.S. war machine, especially with new conditions being set by Washington?
Is there any way in which the U.S. can coexist with a nuclear North Korea?
Anthony, I don't think we can tolerate that risk. The world can't tolerate that risk.
The civilized world must remain united and vigilant against the rogue state's development of a nuclear arsenal. We will never accept a nuclear North Korea.
The rest of the world is quite resolute in this stand we're taking that we will never accept them as a nuclear power.
The DPRK already has nuclear weapons. It's clearly unrealistic they would ever give them up. But that's what the U.S. is now saying justifies an attack. To further explore the context of this war danger, we continue our discussion with expert on the region, Tim Shorrock. U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley recently said that North Korea was begging for war. And certainly there has been agreements in the past between even the U.S. and North Korea that has stalled or completely halted for a period of time their nuclear program. And so let's go back. I mean, the Trump administration is so belligerent, but let's go back to the Clinton administration. There was an agreement that ended up freezing its nuclear program for 12 years.
Right.
So what was that agreement, and then how did Bush muck it up?
Well, so in the late 1980s, North Korea under Kim Il-sung started looking at, having nuclear weapons. And part of the reason was because until 1991, the U.S. had nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea, hundreds of them. These kind of handheld weapons that U.S. soldiers would carry. Their nuclear weapons had hundreds of them in South Korea. And of course, the U.S. 7th Fleet is in Yokosuka, Japan, and very close to Korea. And there's ships there that have nuclear arms, planes. And Okinawa, the U.S. bases are there. And so they saw, building a nuclear capability was a way of defending themselves. They had signed the NPT, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. And when they decided to proceed in a nuclear program, they pulled out of the NPT. And to that pulling out of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty was like a red line for the U.S. And actually, the Clinton administration seriously considered a nuclear strike on the Yongbyon facilities at the time. They came very close to it. And there was a lot of talk of war. It was just like there is, just like today. People might remember, Jimmy Carter went to North Korea, flew to North Korea, met with Kim Il-sung, and they hammered out what became this agreed framework under which North Korea agreed to end its nuclear program, stop its production of plutonium at this plant, and in return, the U.S., because they had to shut down this reactor, the U.S. agreed to supply them with 500,000 tons of fuel oil a year. They had actually shut down their plutonium production in 1991. And so until 12 years later, they didn't produce any. And so when Bush took over in 2001, with all these neocons in his government, like John Bolton and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld were against this agreement, any agreement with North Korea. In his State of the Union address, Bush labeled North Korea as part of the axis of evil with Iran and Iraq. So this was like the last straw for the North Koreans. They said, okay, we now see that you believe we're back in enemy status. And so they pulled out of the agreement themselves and started proceeding on their plutonium program. And by 2006, they had built their first atomic weapon and tested their first weapon in 2006.
Negotiations, didn't they start later on during the Bush administration, and then it was Obama that actually completely, again, destroyed them?
2005, there was a declaration by all, South, North Korea, U.S., Japan, China, and Russia that Korea itself would not be nuclear, would not allow nuclear weapons, North or South. All the countries agreed to that. That agreement with the 5 countries had been violated by the U.S. because at the time the U.S. was still imposing, sanctions kept being imposed, one after the other. And so they felt like this hostile policy had never ended. They exploded their bomb in 2006, partly in response to the strict sanctions that are being imposed unilaterally by the U.S. And when Obama came in 2009, he and his people sort of had this idea that somehow the problem of North Korea would go away because it was going to collapse, that it was bound to collapse, internally. There had been starvation in the past, and the North Korean leadership just didn't have the wherewithal to maintain control and power, and they just figured it was going to go away. And they did not want to negotiate directly with North Korea. So even, Bush was willing to have direct talks with them. Obama was not. Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya, and he had, of course, given up his nuclear weapons. And so, to Kim Jong-il and his son, who's now the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, they saw this happening, and, so the country give up its nuclear weapons and then get invaded and overthrown by a U.S. NATO coalition. And they figured, well, nuclear weapons and a powerful military is our only protection against this happening to us. And so, from then on, they continued to build and to improve on their missiles, and they exploded. Well, I think under Obama, they tested three nuclear bombs, and of course, they just exploded one a few weeks ago.
But representatives have said that they would never strike first, right? And also that this whole history proves that they're willing to negotiate away their nuclear program under certain conditions. So it just seems to contradict the claim that we hear continuously from the U.S., which is this is all about stopping North Korea from having nukes.
Right. It may be, it may be too late to stop them from having nukes. I mean, they have nukes. I mean, they're nuclear power. Right. They have them, and they have obviously really, well-developed missile program. Look, they see themselves surrounded. And of course, the U.S. has a very powerful military in the South. But I mean, U.S. military is in alliance with the South Korean military, which is a very, very powerful military in itself, and Japan's. And they have bases all over, and they have U.S. ships, and of course there's all the U.S. bases around the Pacific region, particularly in Guam, where these B-1B bombers are based that would fly in any kind of attack on North Korea, which just flew. They flew a bunch of them over Korean skies just the last 48 hours.
Constant war games and threats.
Constant war games, constant ratcheting up the tensions. North Korea, and what's kind of interesting when you look at the so-called threats from each side. Like you hear Trump say, fire and fury like the world has never seen before. Like, bringing up images of, that's what Truman said before he dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, the second bomb, right? Similar kinds of words. But it's basically, we're going to inflict a Holocaust on you. And you hear words like Mattis saying, basically we have the capability to completely destroy your country. Annihilate. They keep using this word annihilate. We're going to annihilate your country if you don't denuclearize. If a non-military solution doesn't work out, we're ready to annihilate you. And then you look at their threats. All in America was all shocked when they said they might test some missiles by firing them towards Guam. Why Guam? Well, that's where these B-1 bombers are based, where these B-1 bombers fly regular missions from there over Korean skies. They have massive amounts of firepower on those planes. I mean, they're bunker buster bombs, all kinds of munitions that could blow half the cities of North Korea sky high. So they fly in F-35s from Japan also, the most advanced fighter jets the U.S. has, stealth fighters that can't be seen by radar. So, the U.S. keeps saying, we're ready to annihilate you, and they say, well, we might fire a missile towards Guam, where this. So their threats tend to be more particularized, towards a U.S. base. They fired a missile across, Japan island of Hokkaido about a week ago. Again, they said this puts us in the Pacific theater of war, because they correctly see, the U.S. is a Pacific power, and this is where the war would be.
And it's all you see all day over the news. What are we going to do? This missile was launched. It's just nuts.
The U.S. media never looks at it from their point of view. What is it like to hear your country may be annihilated? Annihilation means everybody's dead. There's 25 million people in North Korea. So we're going to kill 25 million people to prevent them from having one nuclear weapon without even talking to them?
And it's extremely genocidal rhetoric. The fire and fury, reckoning the past of the Korean War. We've seen the fire and fury before. They've lived through it. They've survived it. Mattis, Haley, John McCain threatening essentially genocide. Exactly. How does this type of rhetoric resonate with South Koreans and the administration?
Well, it scares the hell out of people in South Korea, because people are there. Actually, when I was there in April and May, people there are far more worried about what Trump might do than what Kim Jong-un would do. They're used to these kinds of, tensions with North Korea. But they see it primarily as between North Korea and the United States. And, one of the interesting things about the period, the Sunshine period, those years from about, 1999 to 2008, when you had progressive governments in the South and you had this exchange between North and South, is that lots of people from South Korea went north and lots of people from North Korea came south, academic visits, exchanges, sports, cultural, economic, the investment that happened with South Korean companies in North Korea. And that period of time, with all that exchange and engagement, a lot of South Koreans stopped thinking about North Korea in terms of enemy so much. So the whole idea of, us versus them broke down, and people began talking about, how can we take this kind of engagement and slowly move toward reunifying our country at some time. And that's really important for us to understand, because South Koreans, when they hear Trump talking about fire and fury, I guess Trump doesn't realize that thousands and thousands of South Koreans have relatives in North Korea. Their families are. He's talking about their families, maybe their grandfather, their great-grandfather, their brother, So when he's talking about destroying the entire North Korean people, he's talking about destroying their own relative. And they see it as one country, and they don't see it in this divisive way that so many of our leaders do here. And I might add, in both parties, Democrat, Republican, they're the same. You hear the same hawkish stuff from both sides.
And a complete dehumanization of North Koreans, as if they're all just robots who hypnotically following and worshiping their dear leader. They're human beings.
They're human
They're
beings.
human beings.
Because instead of seeing them as just these demonic, crazy people, we should see them as human beings with hopes and dreams for their country like anybody else, and try to reach some common ground with them. Like, if they want us to drop our hostile policy, we should think, what is in our policy that's hostile can we change? Do we have to have, hundreds of nukes pointed at them all the time, from all over the Pacific theater? Do we always have to constantly, have this trade embargo? The embargo has lasted, from the end of the Korean War.
Many in the U.S. establishment are arguing for a major war, as we're talking about, which would no doubt trigger just death and destruction, on a horrific scale. What would that look like for Korea, U.S. soldiers, and if regime change was successfully led by the U.S., what do you think would replace the regime?
So the U.S., you read, like, this CNN story the other day, from Barbara Starr, who's just a shill for the Pentagon. She talks about a 1-month war. They go in there and somehow take out their missile sites and take out nuclear sites. Obviously that in itself would kill tens of thousands of people. But, North Korea, if they're attacked, they're going to fire back. They're not going to take this lying down. So there are, tens of thousands of artillery pieces all along the border. North Korea has hundreds of thousands of artillery all along the border, and Seoul is only 30 miles away. So any kind of U.S. attack would generate a counter response. I mean, the U.S. bases are in the headquarters. U.S. military headquarters is in Seoul. There's a base nearby, and the huge base that's just being completed, the U.S. military base, largest U.S. military base in the world, right near Seoul. Those are all targets. Guam's a target. That's why they have these missiles. Because they see, that's where the U.S. forces are. So if they want to defend themselves, they have to fire hit U.S. planes in Guam, and they fire missiles over Japan because U.S. has a massive military force in Japan. So, an attack on Korea could generate not only counterattack on South Korea, but a counterattack on Japan. I mean, it would be a regional war. And I think that's why a lot of people in the U.S. military and the Pentagon don't want a war, because, a war would be just, they know that it would just suck up huge amounts of resources. And sometimes I look at these, I look at these plans that they feed to Barbara Starr and reporters like that, and I wonder, like, they're also talking about, we have all this. The other day, there's a story in the paper about how, the U.S. presence in Afghanistan is going to probably last until, the end of the century. And so we're going to have this massive military might in the Middle East forever, and then we're going to have a war in Korea. It's just like, I mean, it just starts sounding insane. And you start wondering, you start wondering about the sanity of our military planners here, but there's a lot of people in the U.S. military that know how destructive a war would be in Korea. Anyone who's served there, mountainous country, and the people, they know the North Korean army, would put up a hell of a fight, and they know that the cost would be millions of lives. And I think that's the one factor that's maybe holding back U.S. Trump and his people. But now they're talking, they keep talking about the military option. I mean, Steve Bannon, when he was fired from the White House, apparently, the thing that got him raked over the coals the next day by Secretary of State Tillerson and Secretary of Defense Mattis was a statement that the war is not an option. They could not let that stand. Yes, war is an option. They came back very quickly with that. War is, I mean, to me, it's just obscene to be talking about war as an option when it could kill, millions of people. I guess, Senator Lindsey Graham just says that's people over there. It's not going to bother, it's only those Asian people are going to get killed. Even Japan, but so what? We're not there. But I mean, tens of thousands of Americans could get killed too. And clearly, that's why they're building a nuclear capability to be able to even shoot a nuclear weapon at the United States. They want to deter the United States from attacking them. So I think a war is unthinkable, but apparently not so unthinkable that they're still talking about it and still see it as an option. I think that's very scary that they keep insisting, and that the UN ambassador Nikki Haley keeps talking about this and says, well, if we don't work in diplomacy, what diplomacy? They haven't even tried it yet. Then she's going to hand it over to Secretary of Defense Mattis. I think that kind of language is really scary. And as far as your second question, I mean, what I know from when I've been following these sort of regime changes here, these people at the RAND Corporation, for example, Bruce Bennett, who's a specialist at the RAND Corporation, who thinks that, the target should be Kim Jong-un.
Worked closely on the interview with Seth Rogen. Exactly,
and helped that movie, helped with the end of the movie where they blew his head apart. And said that was a good idea to keep that in. Well, their model is to have the sort of U.S.-induced, regime change from within. Like they're going to somehow win over all these North Korean elites, to somehow go along with some kind of U.S. plan, to have a U.S.-backed government in North Korea, overthrow their government. And when you read carefully what they have to say and hear what they have to say, it's like South Korea isn't even part of their discussion. And there was a sort of rumor that got into a story. Some reporter picked up some intelligence from some counterinsurgency people in Washington who are, consultants and contractors, and they were saying, oh, well, we're talking to the Trump administration about, doing a counterinsurgency in North Korea. I mean, these people are nuts. They don't know anything about Korea. I mean, North Korea has its own, special forces, and of course, South Korea also does. I mean, the idea that somehow the U.S. is going to go in there and direct this regime change in North Korea, and everything's going to be, they're going to have a pro-U.S. government there, and everything's going to be fine, is the same kind of mentality as the United States had in 1945, which is we know what's best for Korea, and we're going to determine it, and we don't give a damn what you Koreans think. It's exactly the same mentality, and somehow, we in America have to learn the real history. We certainly need a deep, deep look at the origins of the Korean War and how the Korean War never ended, and the true nature of that war and what really happened, and the role that South Koreans played in that war. The fact that when the North, came down, that there was partisans all over South Korea that joined the North Korean army. Americans don't know that. A lot of South Koreans don't even know that. But you go to South Korea and you talk to people, and you meet, you hear about their family history, and you hear about, my brother was was one of the partisans, and you hear that kind of talk. I mean, there's this whole history that's hidden from America.